After being abandoned by her daughter at a train station years ago, Ruth has lived with the painful silence between them. But when a chance encounter reveals a hidden truth about that day, Ruth sets out to mend their broken relationship. Will they be able to overcome the years of hurt, or is the distance between them too deep to bridge? Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more exciting content, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's dive in. Ruth sat by the window, her hands resting on the worn armrests of her faded floral chair. The street below her was quiet, and the gray clouds hanging over the sky seemed to match the melancholy that had settled in her heart. The small apartment, once filled with vibrant conversations and laughter, now felt hollow. The walls, adorned with photographs that captured moments from years past, offered only reminders of what had been. The laughter in those photos had long since faded, replaced with an emptiness that Ruth had grown accustomed to, though it still stung. One picture, hanging slightly crooked, caught her attention. It was of Margaret, her daughter, smiling broadly with her high school graduation cap slightly askew on her head. Ruth smiled softly, remembering that day. How proud she'd been of Margaret, her brilliant, ambitious daughter. She had watched her grow from an energetic, curious child into a successful woman. But as much as Ruth cherished that memory, it also reminded her of how far they had drifted apart since then. It wasn't a sudden shift. Life had a way of creating distance between even the closest of people. Ruth understood that Margaret had her own life, her own responsibilities, but understanding it didn't make the growing silence any easier to bear. Their phone calls, once lively and frequent, had become formal and sparse. The visits, once filled with warmth and connection, now felt obligatory, almost as if Margaret had outgrown her mother. Ruth sighed, feeling the weight of those unspoken emotions press down on her. She had never been one to speak up about her feelings. That wasn't how she was raised, and it wasn't how she'd raised Margaret either. But sometimes, she wished she could find the words to tell her daughter how much she missed her. How much it hurt that they had become strangers in so many ways. The memory of that day, the day that had marked the real beginning of their estrangement, loomed large in her mind, as it often did. It had been 5 years since then, but the memory was still sharp, as if it had only just happened. It was supposed to have been a simple visit. Ruth had been planning it for weeks, excited to spend time with Margaret after what had felt like ages. She had packed her best clothes, chosen a thoughtful gift, and taken the train from her small town to the city where Margaret lived. Everything had been going smoothly until she arrived at the station, expecting to see her daughter waiting for her. But Margaret wasn't there. At first, Ruth wasn't worried. She had thought perhaps Margaret was running late. She found a bench near the entrance of the station and sat down, keeping her eyes on the crowd, scanning for her daughter's familiar face. But as the minutes stretched into an hour and then 2, the knot of worry in her stomach began to grow. She had called Margaret's phone several times, but there had been no answer. She told herself it was just a misunderstanding, that Margaret would arrive any moment, apologize for being late, and they would laugh about it. But Margaret didn't come. Ruth remembered the coldness of the metal bench, how it seemed to seep into her bones as the hours passed. She had felt so alone, surrounded by strangers, watching families and friends reunite while she sat there, waiting for someone who never came. The longer she waited, the more her hope dwindled. Each passing minute felt like a small betrayal, though she had tried to push those thoughts aside, not wanting to believe that Margaret would forget about her. Eventually, after what felt like a lifetime, Ruth had taken a taxi back to her hotel, her heart heavy with disappointment. It wasn't until 2 days later that Margaret had called, her voice rushed and distracted, apologizing for missing the pickup, saying something about a work emergency that had come up at the last minute. Ruth had listened quietly, her disappointment too deep for words. Margaret had promised to make it up to her, but the words had felt empty, as if they were said out of obligation more than anything else. Since that day, something between them had shifted. Ruth couldn't pinpoint exactly when it had happened, but the warmth that had once defined their relationship was gone, replaced by an awkwardness that neither of them seemed to know how to navigate. They spoke less frequently, and when they did, the conversations felt forced, as if they were both trying to avoid acknowledging the growing distance between them. Now, as Ruth prepared for another trip to the same train station, the weight of that memory pressed heavily on her chest. She hadn't been back since that day, hadn't wanted to face the emotions that lingered there. But something inside her told her that it was time to confront the past, to try to make sense of what had gone wrong. She rose from her chair slowly, her joints aching with the effort. She moved to the small dresser by her bed and opened the top drawer. Inside was the same small suitcase she had used for that trip 5 years ago. It was old, the fabric worn at the corners, but it still held the memories of that day, the anticipation, the hope, and ultimately the heartache. Ruth began to pack slowly, folding her clothes with care. As she placed each item in the suitcase, her mind wandered to Margaret. She wondered how her daughter was doing, whether she even remembered what had happened that day. They had never really talked about it, never addressed the hurt that had festered in the silence between them. Ruth had wanted to, so many times, but the words had always gotten stuck in her throat. Would this trip be any different? Would Margaret meet her at the station this time? Ruth wasn't sure. Part of her feared that she would be left waiting again, sitting on that cold bench, feeling the same sense of abandonment she had felt all those years ago. But another part of her, the part that still clung to hope, told her that maybe this time, things would be different. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance to mend what had been broken. With her suitcase packed, Ruth took one last look around her apartment. The silence felt heavier than usual today, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to change. She picked up the suitcase and headed for the door, her heart heavy but her resolve firm. It was time to go back, time to face the station, and maybe, just maybe, time to begin healing the rift that had grown between her and Margaret. As she closed the door behind her, the apartment seemed to sigh in her absence, as if it too was letting go of the weight of the past. And with that, Ruth began her journey, both to the station and, she hoped, to a future where she and her daughter might find their way back to each other. The train rattled along the tracks, its rhythmic clatter punctuating the heavy silence in the carriage. Ruth sat by the window, her hands clasped tightly on her lap, her gaze fixed on the blurred landscape outside. The world seemed to rush by in a haze, but inside the train, time moved slowly, almost painfully so. Each passing minute brought her closer to the station, to the place where everything had unraveled. Her heart pounded with a mixture of anticipation and dread, the memories of that day pulling at her with every breath. She had made this journey once before, and the familiarity of it was unsettling. The last time she had traveled this route, her heart had been light with excitement, the promise of seeing Margaret after so long filling her with joy. But that joy had been short-lived, replaced by confusion and disappointment as she waited for her daughter at the station, only to be met with an empty platform and unanswered phone calls. Now, as the train moved steadily toward its destination, Ruth couldn't help but feel the weight of those memories pressing down on her. She had thought that time would dull the pain, that the years would soften the edges of the hurt she had carried since that day. But sitting here, retracing the steps of that fateful trip, it all felt as fresh and raw as ever. The train car was quiet, save for the occasional murmur of conversation from a few rows back. Ruth glanced around at the other passengers, most of them engrossed in their own worlds, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of their phones or tablets. A young couple sat a few seats away, their heads bent close together, whispering and laughing softly. Their easy affection reminded Ruth of how things used to be between her and Margaret, before the distance, before the silence. She shifted in her seat, trying to shake off the melancholy that had settled over her like a heavy cloak. This trip was supposed to be about closure, about confronting the past, and perhaps, if she was lucky, finding a way to move forward. But the closer she got to the station, the more uncertain she felt. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a voice beside her. "First time on this route?" a man's voice asked gently. Ruth turned to see a man sitting across the aisle, his eyes kind and curious. He was in his mid-50s, with graying hair and a warm smile that made her feel at ease despite the heaviness in her heart. She shook her head slightly. "No, I've been here before. A long time ago." The man nodded, as if sensing that there was more to her story than she was willing to share. He didn't press, but there was something in his expression that invited conversation, as if he understood the weight of unspoken burdens. "I'm John," he said after a moment, extending his hand across the aisle. Ruth hesitated for a split second before taking his hand. "Ruth." "Nice to meet you, Ruth." He smiled again, then leaned back in his seat, his gaze shifting to the window. "I always find train rides to be a good time for reflection, don't you? Something about the way the world passes by out there. It gives you space to think." Ruth offered a small nod, unsure of how to respond. She wasn't used to strangers striking up conversations with her, especially ones as seemingly perceptive as John. But there was something about him, an openness perhaps, that made her feel a little less alone in her thoughts. "Are you visiting family?" John asked after a brief pause, his tone casual but gentle. Ruth's fingers tightened around the strap of her purse, and she glanced down at her lap. "Not exactly," she said softly, her voice barely audible above the sound of the train. "I'm going back to a place I haven't been in a long time, to the station where—" Her voice trailed off, the words sticking in her throat. John didn't push her to continue, but his silence was patient, as if he understood that sometimes the hardest stories to tell were the ones that needed to be told the most. After a long moment, Ruth found her voice again. "I'm going back to the station where I waited for my daughter, and she never came." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy and raw. Ruth hadn't planned on telling anyone about the reason for her trip, but something about John's quiet presence had loosened the knot in her chest, just enough for the words to slip out. John's expression softened, his eyes filled with quiet empathy. "That must have been incredibly difficult." Ruth nodded, her throat tight with the effort of holding back the emotions that threatened to spill over. "It was, and I never understood why she didn't show up. We haven't really been close since then." John was quiet for a moment, as if considering her words carefully. "I'm sorry to hear that," he said finally. "It's hard, isn't it, when the people you care about the most drift away?" Ruth blinked, surprised by the sudden swell of emotion that rose in her chest. She hadn't expected to feel so seen, so understood by this stranger. But John's words struck a chord deep within her, a truth she hadn't allowed herself to fully acknowledge until now. "It is hard," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. John nodded slowly. "I haven't spoken to my son in years," he said, his voice low and filled with a quiet sadness. "We had a falling out, and neither of us could find a way back to each other. I think about him all the time, wonder if he ever thinks about me. But the silence between us, it feels like a wall I don't know how to climb." Ruth looked at him, her heart aching with a familiar sense of loss. She hadn't expected to find someone who understood the depth of her pain, but in John's words, she saw a reflection of her own struggles with Margaret. The silence, the distance, the feeling of being abandoned by someone you loved, it was a pain they both knew too well. The train's whistle sounded, breaking the moment of shared understanding. Ruth glanced out the window and realized they were nearing the station. Her stomach clenched with a sudden rush of anxiety. The memories of that day threatened to overwhelm her, as the familiar platform came into view. John must have noticed the tension in her posture, because he spoke softly, his voice calm and reassuring. "Sometimes going back to the place where the hurt began is the only way to start healing." Ruth swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't sure if she believed that healing was possible, not after all these years of pain and silence. But she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't keep running from the past. She had to face it, even if it meant reopening old wounds. As the train slowed to a stop, Ruth gathered her things, her hands trembling slightly. She could feel John's eyes on her, offering silent support as she prepared to step off the train and into the past. "Good luck, Ruth," he said quietly as she stood to leave. She gave him a small, grateful nod, her voice too thick with emotion to respond. And with that, she stepped off the train, her heart heavy with the weight of the memories she had come to confront. The station looked almost exactly as she remembered it. cold, impersonal, and bustling with people who were all too busy with their own lives to notice the small elderly woman standing on the platform, fighting back the tide of emotions that threatened to pull her under. This was the place where everything had changed, the place where the distance between her and Margaret had begun. And now, standing here once again, Ruth couldn't help but wonder if there was still a way to bridge that gap, or if the silence between them had grown too deep to overcome. As Ruth stood on the platform, the air around her seemed to hum with a strange sense of familiarity and dread. The train station bustled with the usual noise of people hurrying to catch trains, others arriving, greetings and goodbyes exchanged, yet it all felt distant and detached. Ruth felt like a ghost in the midst of it all, as if the world was moving at a pace she no longer fit into. Her eyes traced the familiar contours of the station, the long benches where she had sat years ago, the large clock looming overhead that had seemed to mock her with every tick as she waited. Everything looked the same, but to Ruth it all carried the weight of that terrible day when she had waited for Margaret in vain. She couldn't help but feel as though the station itself was holding its breath, as if it remembered too. It had been 5 years, but the memories were still sharp. She could still feel the coldness of the metal bench she had sat on, the way the wind had swept through the station, cutting through her thin jacket as she clutched her phone, repeatedly dialing Margaret's number with trembling hands. Ruth remembered each unanswered ring as if they were blows, each one deepening the pit of despair that had opened in her chest. She closed her eyes, willing the memories to stay in the past, but they surged forward with a force she wasn't prepared for. It had been a bright, crisp morning when Ruth first arrived at the station all those years ago. She had been excited, almost giddy, about seeing Margaret after so long. The estrangement between them hadn't yet fully taken root. There was still warmth, still the hope of a rekindled closeness between them. Ruth had meticulously planned every detail of her trip, from the small gifts she had picked out for Margaret to the dress she had chosen for their reunion, one that she knew her daughter would remember from a time when they had shared happier moments. She had imagined Margaret's smile, the tight embrace they would share, the familiar scent of her daughter's perfume. She had played it out in her mind, over and over, each imagined scenario filling her with joy and anticipation. But the reality of that day had been very different. Ruth had arrived on time as always. She was a woman who lived by her commitments, who took pride in being reliable. She had waited patiently at the edge of the platform, scanning the faces of the crowd, searching for her daughter's familiar figure. As time went on, her excitement began to give way to uncertainty. Margaret wasn't there, but Ruth reassured herself that there had to be a reason, a delay, perhaps. Surely Margaret wouldn't forget. But the minutes stretched on, and doubt began to creep in. Ruth had found a bench, settling herself with the suitcase at her feet, trying to tamp down the growing anxiety that fluttered in her chest. She had waited, checking her watch, scanning the faces around her again and again. People came and went, strangers, mothers greeting children, couples reuniting after trips. She watched these moments, feeling her own hope drain away with each passing reunion that wasn't hers. When she had finally decided to call Margaret, the phone had rung and rung, each unanswered call a small dagger to Ruth's heart. She had left a message, her voice calm but tinged with the unease that was beginning to take hold. Hours passed, and still there had been no word from her daughter. By the time the sun began to set, Ruth had felt a hollow ache deep within her, a growing sense of something breaking inside her that she hadn't known could still break. In the days that followed, Margaret had finally called. Her voice had been rushed, apologetic, but Ruth had heard the distraction in her tone. Margaret had said something about a last-minute work emergency, something that had pulled her away, something important. But Ruth couldn't hear the words over the thudding disappointment in her chest. She had wanted to ask why Margaret hadn't called earlier, why she hadn't found a way to let her know, why she had left her mother waiting for hours, but she hadn't. Instead, she had listened, murmured her understanding, and hung up the phone. That was when things had really started to change. Now, standing on the platform, Ruth felt the weight of that day pressing down on her, making it hard to breathe. She found a bench, the same bench she was almost certain, and sat down slowly, the cold metal beneath her just as unforgiving as it had been back then. The memories swirled in her mind, each one as sharp and painful as the day it had happened. She had never really talked to Margaret about it. Not truly. They had moved on in the sense that life had continued, but the distance between them had grown. Every unanswered phone call, every missed opportunity to visit, had only deepened the chasm that separated them. Ruth sighed deeply, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them together on her lap. She wasn't sure what she had expected from this trip. Closure, maybe. A sense of peace that had eluded her for years. But sitting here, in the very place where she had last felt the depth of Margaret's absence, all she felt was the weight of everything that had been left unsaid. As she sat in silence, a familiar voice from her past startled her out of her thoughts. "Ruth, is that really you?" Ruth looked up, her heart skipping a beat. Standing in front of her was a woman she hadn't seen in years. Eleanor, a kind, older woman who had worked at the station's small cafe when Ruth had first visited that day. Eleanor had been a comforting presence back then, offering Ruth a cup of tea when she noticed her waiting for hours. Though they had only spoken briefly, Ruth had always remembered her kindness. "Eleanor?" Ruth's voice was soft, disbelief threading through it. She hadn't expected to see anyone from that day. "It is you," Eleanor exclaimed, her face lighting up with recognition. "I can't believe it. I always wondered what happened to you after that day." Ruth's heart tightened. "You remember?" "Of course I do," Eleanor said, sitting down beside her. "You were waiting for your daughter, right? I remember seeing you sitting here for hours. I tried to come back and check on you, but by the time my shift ended, you were gone. I always hoped everything had turned out all right." Ruth swallowed hard, unsure of how to respond. How could she explain that nothing had turned out all right? That the relationship with her daughter had only grown more distant since that day? That the hurt had festered in silence for years? "It was a difficult day," Ruth said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "I never did see Margaret." Eleanor's face softened with sympathy. "I'm so sorry, Ruth. I wish I had been able to do more for you that day." Ruth shook her head, her throat tight. "You were kind. That meant a lot." For a moment they sat in silence, the memories of that day hovering between them. Then Eleanor's face brightened with a sudden thought. "You know," she said, her voice hesitant, "I think I saw your daughter that day." Ruth's breath caught in her throat. "What?" Eleanor nodded slowly, as if piecing the memory together. "Yes, I remember now. There was a young woman who came into the station later in the evening. She was asking around looking for someone. I didn't think much of it at the time, but it must have been Margaret. She looked just like you." Ruth felt a strange mixture of emotions swirling inside her. Hope, confusion, disbelief. Could it be true? Had Margaret come to the station after all? "Are you sure?" Ruth asked, her voice trembling. "I'm almost certain," Eleanor said gently. She seemed so frantic, as if something had gone terribly wrong. I always wondered if she found who she was looking for. Ruth's mind raced. If what Eleanor said was true, then Margaret had come to the station that day. But why hadn't they found each other? Why hadn't Margaret explained? There were so many unanswered questions, and now, more than ever, Ruth felt the need to speak to her daughter. The years of silence, the unspoken hurt, it all felt like a tangled web that needed unraveling. But where to begin? Eleanor gave Ruth a soft smile. "Maybe it's not too late to find some answers." Ruth nodded, her heart heavy with the weight of possibilities. Could it be that all these years of distance and hurt had been built on a misunderstanding? Or was there more to the story than either of them knew? As the sounds of the station buzzed around her, Ruth realized that the only way to truly move forward was to finally confront the past, to have the conversation with Margaret that she had been avoiding for so long. It was time to open old wounds, no matter how painful, if there was any hope of healing. The ride back to her small apartment was quiet, the events of the day tumbling through Ruth's mind like an unrelenting tide. Eleanor's revelation had shaken her to the core. Could it really be that Margaret had come to the station that day? All this time, Ruth had believed her daughter had simply forgotten about her, left her to wait in vain. But Eleanor's words suggested a different story. It was a strange mix of emotions. On the one hand, there was the faint flicker of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, Margaret hadn't abandoned her. But on the other hand, there was confusion and a gnawing sense of guilt. If Margaret had been at the station, why had Ruth never heard from her afterward? Why had they never spoken about it, never resolved the misunderstanding? The questions churned inside her, the answers just out of reach. When Ruth arrived back at her apartment, the familiar quiet greeted her. The ticking of the old clock on the wall was the only sound that accompanied her as she set her keys down on the table and slipped off her shoes. She made her way to the small kitchen and put on a pot of tea, her mind still reeling from the weight of everything she had learned. As the kettle began to hiss, Ruth sat at the table, her fingers idly tracing the worn wood surface. She had spent so many years wondering why Margaret had drifted away, why their once close bond had frayed into almost nothing. And now, she was faced with the possibility that their estrangement had been built on a misunderstanding that neither of them had been brave enough to address. The silence between them had grown over the years, like an ever-widening chasm that neither of them could cross. Ruth had let the hurt fester, assuming Margaret's absence meant she didn't care. And Margaret, well, Ruth didn't know what Margaret had thought, but whatever it was, it had been enough to keep them apart for all these years. The kettle whistled, pulling Ruth out of her thoughts. She stood slowly, her joints stiff, and poured herself a cup of tea. As the warm steam rose from the mug, she couldn't help but think about how different things might have been if they had just talked. If Margaret had explained what had happened that day. If Ruth had asked the questions that had weighed so heavily on her heart. But they hadn't, and now, here she was, years later, still carrying the burden of that silence. Ruth moved to the small living room, settling into her favorite chair by the window. The afternoon light filtered through the curtains, casting soft shadows on the floor. She sipped her tea slowly, the warmth of the liquid doing little to soothe the ache in her chest. She thought back to the conversation with John on the train. His words had stayed with her, echoing in her mind like a quiet refrain. Sometimes the silence is harder to bear than the words that might hurt. He had spoken from his own experience, the pain of estrangement from his son evident in the sadness in his eyes. Ruth wondered if John had ever reached out to his son, or if the wall between them had become too high to climb. Was it too late for them, just as she feared it might be too late for her and Margaret? She shook her head, trying to clear the fog of doubt that had settled over her. It wasn't too late. Not yet. If Margaret had come to the station that day, then maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance to repair the broken pieces of their relationship. But Ruth knew that it wouldn't happen on its own. She would have to be the one to make the first move. She would have to break the silence. Her gaze drifted to the small desk in the corner of the room. On it sat a stack of letters, some sent, some unsent, most of them untouched for years. Ruth had always been better with written words than spoken ones. She had written to Margaret many times over the years, letters filled with love, frustration, sadness, but she had never found the courage to send them. The letters had become a kind of therapy for her, a way to express the emotions she couldn't bring herself to speak aloud. But now, sitting here in the quiet of her apartment, Ruth realized that it wasn't enough. The unsent letters were a testament to the years of missed opportunities, of words left unspoken. If she wanted to mend her relationship with Margaret, she couldn't hide behind her letters any longer. She would have to face her daughter, to have the difficult conversation that they had both avoided for so long. With a heavy sigh, Ruth stood and walked to the desk. She rifled through the letters, her fingers brushing over the familiar paper, each one a snapshot of the emotions she had felt over the years. Finally, she found the one she had written shortly after the incident at the train station. It was a letter filled with hurt, confusion, and a deep sense of abandonment. At the time, Ruth had been too angry to send it, but reading it now, she realized that the words still held a truth she had been avoiding. She sank into the chair at the desk and unfolded the letter, her eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. Dear Margaret, I don't know how to say this without sounding bitter, but I need you to understand how much it hurt when you didn't come to the station. I waited for hours, Margaret. I waited, and you never came. I tried to tell myself that there was a reason, that something had come up. But as the hours went by, it became harder and harder to believe that you hadn't just forgotten about me. I don't know why you didn't call, why you didn't let me know what had happened. Maybe it was an honest mistake. Maybe there's something I don't understand. But all I know is that I felt abandoned. I felt like I didn't matter to you anymore. And the worst part is, we've never talked about it. We've just let the silence grow between us. And now it feels like there's this huge distance that I don't know how to cross. I miss you, Margaret. I miss the way we used to talk, the way we used to laugh together. But I don't know how to get back to that place. Maybe it's too late. Maybe you've moved on, and I'm just stuck in the past, holding on to something that's already gone. But I had to write this letter, even if I never send it, because I need you to know how much it hurt. I need you to know that I'm still here, waiting for you. Ruth's hands trembled as she set the letter down. The emotions that had been trapped inside her for so long were bubbling to the surface, threatening to overwhelm her. She had never been good at confrontation, never been one to demand explanations. But maybe that was part of the problem. Maybe if she had spoken up years ago, things would be different now. But she couldn't change the past. All she could do was decide how to move forward. With a deep breath, Ruth reached for a fresh piece of paper. She wasn't going to send the old letter. It was too raw, too filled with the bitterness that had built up over the years. Instead, she would write a new one. One that was honest, but also open to the possibility of healing. She began to write, the words flowing from her heart with a mixture of fear and hope. Dear Margaret, it's been a long time since we've really talked, and I've been carrying something with me that I need to share with you. I've thought about this for years, and I realize now that the silence between us has done more harm than good. I've held on to the hurt from that day at the station for so long, and I never asked you what really happened. I just assumed the worst. But today, I learned something that made me realize I don't know the whole story. I met someone who said they saw you at the station that day, looking for me. I don't know if it's true, but if it is, I think we need to talk about what really happened. I miss you, Margaret. I've missed you for years, and I don't want the distance between us to grow any wider. I don't know if we can fix everything, but I want to try. I hope you do too. With love. Mom. Ruth set down the pen, her heart racing. The letter was simple, but it held everything she needed to say. It was an invitation, an olive branch, a way to start the conversation that had been avoided for so long. With trembling hands, she folded the letter and placed it in an envelope. Tomorrow, she would mail it. And then, all she could do was wait. The weight of the silence between them had been unbearable for too long. Now, it was time to see if they could find their way back to each other. The next morning, Ruth awoke with a heavy yet resolute heart. She had placed the letter carefully on the small table near the door, a quiet reminder of the steps she was about to take. The morning light spilled into the room, softening the edges of her apprehension. Today, she would send the letter. She had made up her mind. It was time to open the door to the conversation she and Margaret had avoided for so long. After a small breakfast and a cup of tea, Ruth slipped on her jacket and picked up the letter. The weight of it felt symbolic in her hands, not heavy in the literal sense, but heavy with the unspoken emotions it carried. As she made her way down the stairs of her apartment building and out onto the street, Ruth felt a slight tremble in her step. She was about to lay bare years of hurt, confusion, and longing. There was no telling what the outcome would be, but deep down, Ruth knew this was the right thing to do. The mailbox wasn't far, just a few blocks away, but with every step, Ruth felt the tension rise. She had played out various scenarios in her mind. How Margaret might react, whether she would respond at all. Would the letter reopen old wounds for Margaret, or would it offer them both a chance to heal? Ruth didn't know, and that uncertainty was almost unbearable. When she finally reached the mailbox, she stood before it for a moment, the letter clutched tightly in her hand. This simple act, dropping the letter into the box, felt monumental. It was a bridge between the past and the future, and the unknown stretched out before her like an endless road. With a deep breath, she opened the mailbox slot and dropped the letter inside. The sound of the envelope hitting the bottom of the box was surprisingly quiet, almost anticlimactic, but Ruth knew that in that simple gesture, a door had been opened. Now all she could do was wait. Days passed, each one dragging on with the kind of slow, oppressive anticipation that seemed to stretch time. Ruth went about her daily routine, cleaning the apartment, visiting the grocery store, and reading, but her thoughts were never far from the letter she had sent. She couldn't help but imagine Margaret receiving it, unfolding the paper, reading the words that Ruth had poured her heart into. She wondered how Margaret would feel. Surprised, maybe, or hurt, or perhaps relieved, just as Ruth had been when she wrote it. The phone sat quietly on the side table, as it always had, but now it seemed to taunt her with its silence. Ruth would find herself glancing at it throughout the day, listening for the sound of a call, a message, anything that would signal a response from Margaret. But there was nothing. A week passed, then another. The knot in Ruth's stomach grew tighter with each passing day. She had hoped for a quick reply, some sign that Margaret had read the letter and was willing to talk. But the silence stretched on, and Ruth began to fear that her daughter might not respond at all. What if Margaret didn't want to reopen the old wounds? What if the letter had only pushed them further apart? On the 10th day after she sent the letter, Ruth was sitting in her chair by the window, absent-mindedly sipping her tea, when there was a knock at the door. Her heart leapt in her chest. It was rare for anyone to visit her unannounced, and for a fleeting moment, she wondered if it could be Margaret. But she quickly pushed the thought aside. No, that wasn't possible. Margaret wouldn't just show up like that, would she? Ruth set her cup down, her hands trembling slightly as she stood and made her way to the door. She hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the doorknob, before finally turning it. When the door swung open, Ruth's breath caught in her throat. There, standing on the threshold, was Margaret. Her daughter's face was a mixture of emotions: surprise, apprehension, and something Ruth couldn't quite place. In Margaret's hand was the letter, folded and slightly crumpled from being carried and reread. Ruth's heart raced as she took in the sight of her daughter, standing just a few feet away, after so many years of distance and silence. "Mom," Margaret said, her voice soft, almost hesitant. "I got your letter." Ruth's throat felt tight, and for a moment she didn't trust herself to speak. She had imagined this moment so many times, but now that it was happening, she wasn't sure what to say. The years of silence between them seemed to stretch out like a vast, uncharted ocean. But here Margaret was, standing at her door, and that was something. "Come in," Ruth finally managed to say, stepping aside to let her daughter inside. Margaret hesitated for a moment before stepping into the small apartment. Ruth closed the door behind her and motioned for Margaret to sit on the sofa. The room felt smaller than usual, the air thick with the weight of unspoken words. Ruth sat down in her chair across from Margaret, her hands folded tightly in her lap. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them felt fragile, like a delicate glass that could shatter with the wrong word. Ruth could see the tension in Margaret's posture, the way she held the letter in her hands, as if it was both a comfort and a burden. "I'm sorry," Margaret said suddenly, her voice breaking the silence. "I'm sorry for not being there that day, for everything." Ruth's heart ached at the rawness in her daughter's voice. She had waited so long to hear those words, and yet, now that they were spoken, she realized that it wasn't the apology itself that mattered. It was the fact that Margaret was here, that she was willing to talk. "I never meant to hurt you," Margaret continued, her voice thick with emotion. I didn't know how to explain what happened. That day at the station, I was running late because of work. By the time I got there, you were already gone. I tried to call, but I don't know. Things just got away from me. And after that, it just seemed like there was too much distance between us. I didn't know how to fix it." Ruth swallowed hard, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. "I didn't know, Margaret. I thought you had forgotten about me, that you didn't want to see me." Margaret shook her head, her eyes filled with regret. "I never wanted that, Mom. I've missed you. I've missed us. But the longer we didn't talk, the harder it got to reach out." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of all the years they had lost. Ruth could feel the tension in her chest loosen, just a little, as she realized that the pain she had carried for so long hadn't been hers alone. Margaret had carried it too, in her own way. "I've missed you too," Ruth said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. "I've missed you every day." Margaret looked down at the letter in her hands, her fingers tracing the edges of the paper. "I read this letter so many times," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know if I could face you. But I didn't want to lose you, not completely." Ruth's heart swelled with a mixture of relief and sadness. They had both been trapped by their own fear of rejection, by the silence that had grown between them. But now, sitting here together, the gap didn't seem so insurmountable. "We don't have to fix everything today," Ruth said gently, her voice soft but steady. "But I don't want to lose you either. We can start slow if that's what you need. We can try again." Margaret nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I'd like that, Mom." For the first time in years, Ruth felt a sense of peace settle over her. It wasn't a perfect resolution, and it wouldn't erase the hurt they had both experienced. But it was a start. They had both taken the first steps toward healing, and that was enough for now. Ruth reached out and gently took Margaret's hand in hers. The silence between them was no longer heavy or painful. It was simply a quiet space, filled with the promise of what was to come. And in that moment, Ruth knew that they were both ready to move forward, together. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.